Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Maria Leonor Maia, President of FAUBAI, Brazilian Association for International Education, and also Dean of International Affairs at the Federal University of Pernambuco. On behalf of FAUBAI Board of Directors, I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar series named Virtual Wednesday, or Quartas Virtuais, which main subject is virtual exchange, virtual mobility. The series is structured into 4 sessions. One was last week, one is today, and we have 2 more in the following Wednesdays. The first session is already available in our website, www.faubai.org.br. As we know well, COVID-19 has strongly affected our lives, and in particularly higher education activities. As I said in our first session last week, what we propose to discuss in this webinar is collaborative online teaching and learning as a path or as a new way of connecting people and knowledge. For this discussion today of virtual exchange and global learning, we invited 3 experts, Sarah Gut, Eva Haug, and Stephanie Doscher. Thanks each of you for accepting our invitation. Thanks also to José Celso Freire Jr., who organizes this series, and also René Zickman, our moderator and member of our board, for all the support. I wish you all a fruitful Wednesday. Thank you. Welcome. René, please.
Yes. Hello, you all. Thank you again. Thank you for waiting a little bit. With this challenging time comes the opportunity to step us as global citizens. I was thinking about from yesterday that many of us would be in St. Louis this week, discussing internationalization of higher education at the NASA annual conference that has been canceled as many other conferences. More than ever, IT devices, computers, tablets, cell phones are gates for the world. But sometimes it's not always easy to move to online to virtual education. We need to re-examine the higher education and higher education internationalization paradigms. Studying abroad without going abroad. Internationalization at home, internationalization of the curriculum, virtual exchange, international cooperation. This webinar will offer the opportunity of knowing experiences and possibilities of virtual exchange from specialists and institutions that have been doing this for many years. It's a great pleasure. Please, Celso. Next one. It's a great pleasure to have with us for the second FAUBAI BRaVE. Oh, yes. No, please, the orientations. This is very important. Yes. Some very few orientations, but really very strongly important questions can be submitted in the QA. You have to look for at the top, the bottom area in English, please. We are not translators. We cannot do it in English in this way. We will select questions to be answered at the end of all presentations. And as our President Maria Maia told us, the slides and the recording of the webinar will be made available on the FAUBAI website. Please, Celso. And then it's a great pleasure to have with us for the second FAUBAI BRaVE webinar, 3, and I'm not exaggerating, 3 of the world's best known specialists on virtual exchange. They are all of them, regularly invited all around the world to train staff in intercultural and online collaboration. I will present really very shortly bios of these 3 top women speakers. Sara Guth is English language teacher at Università degli Studi di Padova in Italy. She's president as well of Unique Collaboration, a cross-disciplinary professional organization for tele-collaboration and virtual exchange in higher education. Sara is also project manager of Unique Collaboration in Erasmus Plus Virtual Exchange, an innovative project enabling youth to engage in intercultural experiences online. She's also a researcher for Evaluate Project, an European policy experiment project funded by Erasmus Plus that have published last year a report on the impact of virtual exchange on initial teacher education, evaluating collaborative teacher education. Stephanie Dutcher is director, the second one, is director of the Office of Global Learning Initiatives at Florida International University in the US. The Office of Global Learning Initiatives mission is to prepare students to be global citizens, engaging students in active, team-based, interdisciplinary exploration for real-world problems. As part of her work, Stephanie leads FIU's COIL, and is also program evaluator for the FIU's Kimberly Green Latin America and Caribbean National Resource Center. Eva Hock works as a coordinator internationalization, COIL coordinator, and senior lecturer of intercultural competence at the Faculty of Business and Economics in the Amsterdam University of Applied Science in the Netherlands. She's also an associate of the European Association for International Education, EAIE, expert community internationalization at home. Eva is specialized in internationalization of the curriculum. As COIL coordinator at the Amsterdam University of Applied Science, Eva provides the possibility of experiencing international teamwork by pairing students from around the globe. Thanks. Really, thank you all, Eva, Sara, and Stephanie, for accepting FAUBAI's invitation for this second BRaVE webinar. And thanks all the participants. We have now 263 attendees for the webinar, and it's just starting. Now I would like to give the floor to Sara Guth to start the second FAUBAI BRaVE webinar on virtual exchange and global learning. Please, Sara, our virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Renee, Nona, and Celso for inviting all of us, and we're happy to be here. So we've, as a group, we've decided to keep our presentations relatively short because we feel like there's a lot of benefit that can come from interacting with participants and the questions they might have. And we've also agreed that we might interject in one another's presentations as we're speaking as a sort of conversation. So that's just to give you an idea of how we're planning to run the next hour or so. So I've been given the task of kind of looking back in time, and I think what Renee said is obvious, and it's on all of our minds now that with COVID-19, there's been an increased interest in the type of work that Stephanie, Eva, and I will be talking about, and that many of you probably have been doing. That said, it's not new, and it's been around for a while. And I think it's important to understand the history and where it comes from. So Celso, could you go to the next slide? And actually the next one. We may as well just start with the next one. There we go. So I decided to start just talking about schools because so I'm not sure actually who's in the audience, and this is kind of one of the unfortunate things about webinars is you don't know who your audience is exactly. But I presume that many of us are in higher education, and I think it's really interesting to look back in history and see that this concept of connecting young people with one another to learn about one another and from one another has been very normal in schools for a very long time. So depending on your age and where you grew up, you might have been a pen pal with somebody in another culture, or it might have been e-pals once the internet and email became more normalized. But you know, that was specifically student to student interaction, so kind of one-on-one, right? And then in the European context, because as Renee said, I'm working in Italy, eTwinning became a very successful project, which brought classes of different students together. So it was a more class-to-class interaction. But again, it was at the schools K-12 level. And it's interesting that these projects have been around much longer than this type of activity in higher education. And I think one of the reasons is that in higher education, in some ways, to some degree, there was the expectation that physical mobility or study abroad would be the way that people would get intercultural competence and experiences. But of course, we all know that that was flawed, because we all know that the percentage of students who actually engage in physical mobility at the higher education level is quite low. So Celso, if you could click. No, you're going backwards. There we go. Okay. So this is the fun slide of terminology, and it's not even complete. So I'll just be forthright about that from the start. But the fact is that this type of activity that was started with pen pals and eTwinning started to enter higher education. And I think it is now really coming into its prime. I think virtual exchange is becoming accepted on a much larger level. But initially, there were kind of groups of people in different parts of the world doing similar types of activities, but calling it different things. So especially if you're new to the field, it's important to know this, so that if you're looking up articles or you know, on the internet, who's doing this, what's been done, it's important to know the different types of words that have been used. And I think when Stephanie and Ava talk, they'll also be using, you know, the terminology that's familiar to them in their context. And again, because it's a relatively new field, there is still not any kind of total general agreement on what we should call this. So it's important to know what terms have been and are being used. So as pen pals, you know, at the beginning when I was talking about schools, it were very often foreign language classes. Similarly, telecollaboration was this type of student to student, class to class activity that started developing within the context of foreign language education at the turn of the century, basically. So it's been over 20 years now. But it was very much limited to the field of foreign language teaching and learning. Around 2006, so a few years later, at the SUNY Coyle Center in New York, John Rubin came up with the acronym Collaborative Online International Learning to highlight the different aspects of this kind of activity that were important, in the sense that it would be collaborative and international. And it's been interesting over the years, over the past 15 years, that some people see the international, could even be intercultural instead of international. And I'll explain a little more about that later. Another term that was used early on was globally networked learning, and that really highlights the concept of networking. Another term was online intercultural exchange, and so this one highlights the intercultural and the fact that it's exchange, which I think is very important. Then e-tandem is another one that comes from foreign language learning, and I just put the picture there from Teletandem Brazil, which is a very successful, amazing project that has come out of Brazil. And it's, you know, primarily foreign language learners, but it's been very successful. Then our colleagues at DePaul University in the States talk about global learning experience, and Stephanie will talk to you about her other global words. So just so you know, there are lots of different words out there, but I think the ones we're primarily using today are COIL and Celso, if you could click.
No, wait, before we do that, because
Sure.
Sarah, remember,
Sure.
So I want to throw something in. Brussels recently, Erasmus announced that they're going to use virtual mobility.
Yeah.
I have strong opinions about that term. What do you think?
Yeah, I realized this after I had already shared the slides for the presentation that I had not included virtual mobility. And I do think there is a lot of tension and discussion around this difference between virtual exchange and virtual mobility. I think, so if you're asking my opinion, mobility implies mobility, obviously, right? Whether it's virtual or not. Whereas what's important in the term virtual exchange is the word exchange, that there's actually an interaction of people and they're exchanging ideas and opinions and learning together. I would say that my understanding of the way that virtual mobility is often used is more a type of online learning where people have joint degrees or you can take courses at other universities. And this might entail some form of interaction between students, but it also might not. It might just entail accessing content that somebody in your partner, a course in your partner university has made available to you, but that doesn't necessarily imply that there's interaction between young people. And so that's why I think those of us who are strong promoters of virtual exchange are also very sensitive about this because actually, Celso, if you could click now. In the second point there, it says sustain technology-enabled people-to-people education program. And I really think the people-to-people is important. So virtual exchange is not about accessing content online and completing assignments. It's about engaging and interacting with other people. Whereas virtual mobility, I think, can be both, but it is more primarily accessing courses in different universities. And so there's this umbrella term that has come out in the past few years, which is virtual exchange, which not everybody's happy with because people have issues with the word virtual. But I think everybody agrees with the word exchange, at least. And so I put as the first point that it's a practice because we do it, we engage in it. Ava, Stephanie, and I are all engaging in this, and it's also an academic field of research, right? And I think that's really important. That we're not just doing it, but we're constantly analyzing it and studying it and researching it to see what works and what doesn't work and what we could do to improve it. In the second point where it says sustained, the point there is that this is not a one-off. When we talk about virtual exchange or COIL, we're not talking about people meeting on social media a few times. It is sustained over a period of time. And then in the third point, we talk about the fact that it's communication and interaction, important, that takes place between individuals or groups, so it could also be small groups of people, who are geographically separated or from different cultural backgrounds. So that goes back to when I was discussing COIL being collaborative online international learning. Maybe it should be intercultural learning because we could very well do this type of activity between different cultural groups within our own communities, right? It doesn't have, yes, definitely.
It can also be interdisciplinary.
Yes, absolutely. Yep. So another eye out there. And then the next point is that, which is really important, is that it is supported and led by educators and facilitators. So this is not, a Duolingo or some activity that students are doing on their own in some, on the internet, but it really is structured by facilitators and scaffolded by them. So the learning process is very much scaffolded by discussions that take place in the classroom between teachers and their students locally. And so, yeah, it's an attempt to bring together the deep impact of intercultural dialogue and exchange with the broad reach of digital technology. Next slide, please. So these are just the aims of virtual exchange or COIL or the other words we'll be using today. But it's just pretty much repeating what I said before. So it's obviously something we've been pushing even before COVID-19 to allow an increasing number of people to have these meaningful intercultural experiences. But for them to be meaningful, they have to be interactive. You have to have people interacting with one another and exchanging with one another. And so, yeah, it's an attempt to bring together the deep impact of intercultural dialogue and exchange with the broad reach of digital technology. Next slide, please. So these are just the aims of virtual exchange or COIL or the other words we'll be using today. But it's just pretty much repeating what I said before. So it's obviously something we've been pushing even before COVID-19 to allow an increasing number of people to have these meaningful intercultural experiences. But for them to be meaningful, they have to be interactive. You have to have people interacting with one another. And it, I think going back to what Nona and Renee said at the beginning, it is to increase mutual understanding and the sense of global citizenship. And unfortunately, COVID-19 has given us a sense of the fact that we really are all connected, more than anything that I've experienced in my lifetime. And it's unfortunate that this is what's happened, but we really are all part of the same world. But also digital literacies and other employability skills, such as foreign language and communication skills, media literacy, and the ability to work in a diverse cultural context. And I think my colleagues later on will speak to the fact that even I myself have experienced by teaching my normal courses online. My students have not willingly, but having been forced to learn to use technology and work together online in a way that they had never planned to. So, okay, and the last of my slides, pretty much, Celso. So I think what's interesting, and this is just where I wanted to finish, is that virtual exchange very much started at the grassroots level with individual teachers, people like Ava and Stephanie and myself who were, sorry, there's a fly going around here. I keep on, it's spring here. So they started very much with individual teachers doing their own initiatives, not necessarily with the support of their institutions or the departments, but people who really believed that this was something of value for their students. And these people fought and advocated for many years to get institutional engagement and governmental engagement. And so if we go back to the idea of why we're using this term virtual exchange now, there are these two very big government funded initiatives in the United States and in Europe. In the US, it's the Stevens Initiative, and in Europe, it's Erasmus Plus Virtual Exchange. And they both initiatives decided to use the term virtual exchange. But it's been very important, I think, for those of us who've been involved with this for many years, to see in the past few years that there's recognition of the value of this kind of activity on that level, on the state level, on the national level. And if you could click just to the next one. So where to next? I'm just going to end here by saying that today Erasmus Plus, so in the European context, sent out a tweet saying that they were pushing forward blended mobility, which is another thing I think the three of us have been involved in. So there's some type of virtual exchange surrounding the physical mobility. And so the EU has said that they're going to push the virtual exchange in the first semester next year, with the hope that maybe some borders might open in the second semester. Exactly, I agree with Ava. I don't think so either, but but it's interesting how they're trying to use this context to promote virtual exchange. And as any sick social media user does, I went and looked at the comments that some people were making to this tweet. And there's a lot of negative reaction and this continuous idea that physical mobility is the only way to get a true virtual intercultural, a real intercultural experience. And that leads me to two thoughts that I'll leave for Ava to pick up on. One, I think that these people have not had a good virtual exchange experience in which they actually did build relationships with people and feel like they had an intercultural experience. And two, that even if mobility is the best way, there's still 80, 90, 95%, depending on the country you're in, of people who are not going on mobility. So COVID or not, there's still a large percentage of people who aren't doing that. So with that, that's my where to next. I'll leave it to you, Ava. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Please, Eva, go ahead.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having us. Everyone at FAUBAI, big shout out to all the really wonderful work you're doing. I think we can go immediately into the next slide. That's just a picture of one of the projects that some students in a marketing program initiated where they collaborated with an entrepreneur and they created sweaters. So the where to next, let's go to Amsterdam to look at an example. Could we go to the next slide? Because for us, internationalization at home is the focus of our internationalization policy. As Sarah already mentioned, 80 to 90%, and it's actually more around 90%, so 90% of students do not go on exchange. They're non-mobile students. They're very mobile, but they're not mobile internationally. And they are also very intercultural, sometimes international, but they don't cross borders necessarily. That can be for a multitude of reasons. I think it was in one of the Nordic countries, in one of the Scandinavian countries, that the term cultural elite was first used, but we often refer to the small group of students who can go on an exchange on mobility, the cultural elite. And I think it's important to remember that we also need to provide, you know, the 90% of students in international and intercultural experience. So in the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences, because we are a very multicultural city, but also an international hub, we want our graduates, when they finish the university, to be employable. And part of employability skills is that you have some international and intercultural skills, that you know how to work in diverse teams with multiple perspectives. So if virtual exchange is one of the ways to work towards this internationalization at home, and we see it as one of the tools, what is of course very important is the question whether virtual exchange, and we in our university, we prefer to use the term COIL, Collaborative Online International Learning, but for the sake of this presentation, I'm using virtual exchange. But if internationalization at home means that it's intentional, purposeful, and it's for all students, then we need to look at virtual exchange at, is it accessible for all students? Is it accessible to all students? So therefore, is it scalable? So what we often see, there's a lot of models where in virtual exchange is introduced in a university where a professor is interested in doing this and or has a partner that he or she would like to work with, sets up a COIL project, and the students who are lucky enough to be in the classroom of this innovative and probably inspiring and inspired professor, you know, are lucky to have one of those experiences. What we try to do in Amsterdam is not leave it up to sort of chance or fate whether a student would end up with that professor, but we try to find a way to make it accessible to all students. So in the marketing and sales program, that's one of the Dutch stream programs. So that means that the language of instruction is Dutch. And that's a language now spoken by many people. Therefore, we cannot have international students in our classroom because, except for Belgium, not many people speak Dutch. So we needed to find a way to give all those students an international experience. So what we started in 2014, because we had a lot of experience with virtual exchange, but it was always the hybrid or blended version that I just heard is a new term now. What was it again? Not virtual mobility. Well, there was a new blended mobility, I believe.
Exactly.
Exactly. So we did
blended
that.
Mobility.
We already did that since early 2000. We usually go to neighboring countries, to Germany, Belgium, sometimes Spain. Students go visit a campus, work with students there, and then upon return, continue the work at a distance, and then sometimes finish again where they meet live. But then we also wanted to work with partners and with countries that were not accessible for travel, so maybe outside of Europe. So that's when we started to call it COIL, and no longer the hybrid version, and no longer limited to the partners that we could actually physically visit. So 2014, we started with a pilot with 2 projects and 60 students participated. And then we tweaked that model once we had the best practice and we understood a little bit how this modality, how this type of teaching and learning works. We started to look for opportunities to embed it in our regular mandatory curriculum. So we call it COIL enhanced modules. So the existing curriculum that all students have to go through, for example, an international marketing module that all students have to take, we enhance that with a COIL project, which makes it a compulsory program and part of the curriculum in semester 3 or 4 for students. And we do it intentionally in semester 3 or 4, because that gives them still 4 semesters to maybe go on exchange or do an international internship, or, you know, spread their wings. So we've been gradually growing that model. And since 2017, we've been doing 30 to 35 projects per year, which offers about 900 plus students in the business school. So I'm just talking about the business school. There are more projects going on, luckily, but the opportunity to do this kind of COIL work or VE work. Could I see the next slide, please? That would be wonderful. Thank you. So how do we get there? First of all, I think it's very important, and Stephanie will probably address this. You need to connect to the vision and strategy of the university, or sometimes even, I mean, we even tapped into the vision of our government. So what do we want with internationalization? So if you can't do virtual exchange for virtual exchange's sake, it needs to connect to something. And for us, it connects with a number of values that we find important, which are diversity. So allowing students to learn to work in diverse teams and to deal with diversity. Sustainability, because it's a more sustainable way of having an international experience, because we also know that traveling and all these Erasmus students flying back and forth is actually quite a heavy imprint on our ecology. So less traveling, or if we travel by train, that is also part of the values of the university. And then intercultural awareness or international skills. So we tapped into the vision and the strategy of the university, and then we found it important to really think about how do we coordinate this. So where do we do it, and who do we involve? Who are the stakeholders? All the different pieces of the puzzle that help make it a full picture. And we started by identifying champions. So which professors would be, or which programs or which modules would be most suitable. So we tried to find, and this is an expression that I am borrowing from a colleague from who's in South Africa, the low-hanging fruit, where you don't need to stretch that much, but you can still get some success. But it's always important to not just have a vision and long-term. Long-term strategy is very important, but also see what kind of low-hanging fruit is out there, so that people know what they're working for and what it could do. So the low-hanging fruit would be, for example, partnerships that were ideal, or projects that already existed that were ideal for this kind of work. Then the partnering piece is strategically very important. The existing partnerships, so we actually were able to strengthen the existing partnerships that we had, because often they were based on one student that we exchanged, where now all of a sudden professors are working together, and not just one student, but 60 students are working together. So it has strengthened our existing partnerships, our network, and it has actually expanded, because it allows us to work with universities with whom we do not have an MOU or an Erasmus agreement, because everything is done, all the organizational and logistical administration is done on your own campus. So you can actually work with partners that might be very interesting, but not interesting enough for your deans to sign an MOU with, but still, with regards to the content, be good partners. And then, of course, very important to train, to help facilitate people to do this kind of work, so that people feel empowered and excited and capable to not just do COIL, but to deal with the cultural learning that goes on, because it's more the process actually than the actual topic that we're doing. And you need to, I think, empower and facilitate professors to do that kind of work. Could we go to the next slide, please? So like I said,
Eva, just since you intervened, I think it would be good for me to intervene here, that in my experience as well with the training, that it also changes the way professors see their teaching in general. So it's very much kind of a pedagogical transformation, which I think is even more relevant now in the times of COVID-19, where so many people are having to take their teaching online. So I'm wondering if that's been the same in your experience.
Yeah, I agree completely, and I think right now what we're seeing, there's an openness to using tools that they otherwise would not use, because we're using them anyway for this remote teaching or blended teaching that we're doing. So they're more familiar with video conferencing tools. They're with many of the tools, Google Docs, some of the things that for people who have been working in virtual exchanges is already so familiar. But we sometimes forget that it's very new. But thanks to this current situation that we were thrown into, I lost my slide. Oh, there it is. There is more openness. It's less scary, and it's something that people can actually see happening. And what we found is actually that the training could be, if used properly, an interesting or maybe an important part of your professional development program. Because I think for me personally, once I started collaborating with colleagues all over the world, it actually made me a better teacher, because it made me look at my own teaching, my beliefs, my biases. So working with a colleague, just like the students are doing, actually bringing in other perspectives into my own teaching practice has made me a better professor, I think. So it can also help in that way, but maybe that's more of an umbrella goal. I don't know. What do you think, Sarah?
No, I agree. I think it's just, again, if we go back to comparing virtual mobility and virtual exchange, the underlying concepts of the virtual exchange or COIL model are that students interact with one another, work together, learn to work together in teamwork. And this model is very unfamiliar, I think, to people in a lot of places in the world. And so it's through that training to develop your own virtual exchange that you're forced to see that there are different pedagogies out there, and that might influence your teaching in the classroom and online and in many different contexts. So I agree, it's just as much a learning experience for the teachers as it is for the students.
Absolutely. Stephanie, have you found that too?
Yes, and I was also thinking that it was very nice of both of you to set up part of what I will be talking about in a moment when it comes to thinking about the mindset of faculty and the relationship between the kind of teaching and learning that happens in a COIL course and professional development, how important the training, the support, the coaching, but also the community of faculty who are doing this work, how we learn from each other. We're talking a lot about students and how much we care about students and what we're offering to our students, but I have found that this is just as much a transformation for faculty, but also the staff and the administrators and leaders that are supporting the staff, the faculty and the students.
Yeah, absolutely. Preaching to the choir here, you know, I absolutely agree with you. If we go back a little bit to the, you know, when I said earlier that virtual exchange or an no, sorry, Celso, I didn't mean literally. This was the correct slide. Thank you. When we talked about internationalization at home being accessible to also being inclusive, therefore including all students, in general, but now more so than ever, we have to think at how equally. So if you set up COIL projects between students in Amsterdam, and for example, students, I'm going to use an example of a project that we're doing at this moment, for example, in Durban, South Africa. So maybe the professors, you know, they design something where, you know, students on both ends have exactly the same opportunities to participate. But as we're seeing now, and we saw that because the campuses were closed, everybody went into a lockdown also in South Africa. But when the students in South Africa had to move off campus, when they had to go home, they no longer had access to free internet. And they didn't always have access to laptops or computers with the tools and apps necessary to do video conferencing. So, you know, even though they were treated as equal, there was not a lot of equity. So the access to the means, the resources that we sometimes need to do this work is something that we need to be very mindful of. And so could we go to the next slide? So that is, it could be a problem, but I also see it as a tremendous opportunity, because I think one of the things that we maybe lost, where we lost ourselves a little bit with virtual exchange, and this influx of all kinds of tools and technology that became accessible and affordable also for professors, that we got lost in the tech. Where I think, especially now that we are seeing that there's not equitable access to maybe the tools that we need to do virtual exchange, in a way, it's back to basics, where we really need to look at the pedagogy. What do you want if you want students to have an intercultural experience, it's not about teaching them to use Zoom. It's about engaging in a dialogue, having a meaningful conversation, learning from one another, practicing open-mindedness, all those things. And what I always tell our professors when they're slightly intimidated by the technology, I said, it's not about the technology, it's about the pedagogy. And you already know how to do that because that's your expertise. You're working in an institution of higher education, so you know how to teach. Of course, you might need some help how to do that in a virtual environment or in an online environment using certain tools. And you need to figure out how can it be collaborative, especially if it's interdisciplinary. Yes, granted, but it's still about pedagogy. And that is something that a lot of professors, they forget that this is something they can do and that they can find help for. So I always think it's important to always keep reminding people that tech follows pedagogy. And sometimes simpler is actually better. So I think the next slide is my last one. Could we? Yes. So just to give you an example, even with everything that happened the moment so in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, we went into lockdown. The campus closed on March 12th. And all the projects, all the international projects we had set up came to a grinding halt, except for some of our COIL projects. And in spite of all the difficulties, because the lockdown didn't happen in every country at the same time, we are now, at this very moment, there are students involved in a virtual project with Brazil, with Fateki, with South Africa, Durban, and with Philadelphia, Drexel University in Philadelphia in the USA. They are very different, and some use very simple, very basic tools. Some can use slightly more elaborate technology, but they are all these students are talking about how is COVID and this new normal impacting you. And it gives all of them a sense of normalcy and a sense of hope and a sense of connectiveness. They're all alone at home or back home with their parents, but they are slightly connected through this virtual exchange. So to me, this is reassuring that when everything else fails, this, even though it's hard, I'm not saying it's easy, but you can still continue to do this kind of work. And I think that's one of the reasons we're having this webinar. That's it for me. Thank you so much. Over to you, Stephanie.
Stephanie, you can go, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Eva, I could not agree with you more. COIL is indestructible. Virtual exchange, I think of it as indestructible. And it's because we're creating a network of relationships that go beyond the bottom line. They go beyond the exchange of money, the exchange of agreements. These are relationships that our students are making, our faculty and our administrators are making, that become personal as well as professional relationships. And I think that that's a good place for me to set the stage in talking about the particular instance at Florida International University. So Sarah was talking about the history of COIL and virtual exchange, and Eva was talking about her institution where COIL is implemented primarily within one portion of the institution. And I've been asked to talk about how have we been able to spread COIL across the whole institution. Right now, 9 of our 11 colleges and schools have COIL within the programs. How did we do that? Florida International University is, by many measures, one of the 10 largest universities in the United States. We have 34,000 undergraduate students, and the majority of our students are Latin American and Hispanic. They are about 70% of our students are Latin American, Hispanic. About 12% of our students are Black, African American, also Afro-Caribbean. and a very small minority look like me, a gringa. So we're a very diverse institution in the context of the United States. We look a lot more like Latin America. We're also an institution where our students do not live on campus. They live at home. They live all over the world. They may take classes fully online, and they work probably 20 hours or more every week to work themselves through school. And when our institution was founded, which was not very long ago in 1972, the idea was that every single student would study abroad when the university was first opened. But very quickly, the leaders found exactly what we find now, which is that there are a lot of reasons why students don't travel during their college or university experience, or they don't travel for credit. Maybe they travel with their family or for fun or for service, or maybe for internships, but not necessarily as part of a class. So the university, we kept doing what we have been doing. We're called Florida International University. It's in our middle name. So you would think that we have a very international outlook. But in 2008, we started to ask ourselves, are we really internationalized? And people said there was something missing. So we tried to figure out what that was. Every one of the different groups of our university, our students, our faculty, our staff, our alumni, said the thing that's the most international about FIU is the diversity of the student body and of the faculty and of our community. It's really a global crossroads. But they said that that diversity, those different perspectives, weren't being brought into the classroom as part of what we learn from. We're still learning from books and maybe just the teacher lecturing. So we realized, okay, to be more international, we have to do something to bring our diversity into the classroom. And it has to be focused on connection making, and it also has to be focused on the way the world is right now, which is that even if we are thinking about how to serve our local community, which was part of the founding mission of our university, the problems and the challenges that we face are affected by the rest of the world, or the way we solve those problems affects the rest of the world. And as Sarah was saying, there's no experience that I think any of us can remember that has made us more knowledgeable, more understanding at a deep level that we are completely interconnected world. So we acknowledged that our university by itself, no discipline, no group, no single person can ever completely understand any question or problem that we face in the world. So how do we go out and work with other people to learn about the way the world works and to create solutions? And that is where Global Learning for Global Citizenship was born. So it is a 10-year plan to enhance the quality of education for all of our students, all 38,000 students. Every single student takes at least 2 global learning courses before they graduate, and we have over 250 of them, and they are embedded within every single program of study. So every student takes a course as part of their required program of study for their major, for their degree, or they can choose from a series of elective courses that are within that major program or degree. And also there are activities in the co-curriculum on campus, in the community, and abroad that also are global learning. So what is global learning? And that's what we would, that's the next slide. So we don't think of global learning as what you learn, and it's not where you learn, but it's how you learn. It's a process. It's the same process that I just described. It involves diverse people, their diverse perspectives, cultural perspectives, disciplinary perspectives, geographic, maybe time, gender. It's a process that involves diverse people in collaborative efforts to analyze, to understand, and to make solutions for complex problems that transcend borders of difference. Problems that are both local and global. Problems that impact different people in different ways, depending on their background, their economic supports, their beliefs and values, or where they live in the world. Global learning is at its heart about making connections between diverse perspectives or amongst diverse perspectives about complex problems. So, how do we infuse that process into all of our global learning courses? And then I'm going to share with you, although you're probably already figuring it out already, why we do COIL as part of our global learning initiative. So the next slide, if you wouldn't mind. So every global learning course has certain requirements in order to get the designation. One, the first thing is that all global learning courses are built to develop our students' global awareness. That means that they have a better ability to conceptualize, to think of the world as a complex place, to realize that the world is interconnected at local, national, global levels, and those different levels are interconnected. Global awareness is being able to realize that the world is very complex. Then there's global perspective. Every global learning course is to help our students see the world from different perspectives. And nobody can do that by themselves. So it's about exchanging perspectives, the way that Sarah was talking, and connecting them. And it's that connecting place that's about global engagement, that the course and the activity will help our students to feel more willing to connect with people who are different from them in order to understand and address these complex problems. That's what global engagement is all about. So every course, we have traditional ways of assessing student learning, like tests and essays, so we can understand, do our students understand basic background concepts in our field, but also more authentic tasks, where the students are actually grappling with, they're struggling with real tasks, like they're writing new laws, they're engaging in role plays, they're creating new designs for buildings. We're not just testing them on these things, but we're letting them try their hands at making things. And all global learning courses have to involve collaboration, because we acknowledge that there's diversity within our classroom. Even if everybody looks the same, that doesn't mean that they think the same. And people who think very similarly may look really different on the outside. So we're acknowledging that there's diversity in our classroom. Global learning can happen if the class is face-to-face. It can happen in the community. It can happen in a study abroad, or it can happen online. And then the last piece is diverse content and readings. So students will listen to podcasts, or they will analyze Twitter threads, because sometimes they're thinking about problems and issues where there is no textbook. There is no journal article. If we're trying to understand COVID, they have to actually go and read the studies that epidemiologists are creating. They maybe are trying to understand how people are dealing with it by analyzing social media or newspapers. So we bring in all kinds of sources of knowledge into global learning courses. So if you would go to the next slide. So global learning or global citizenship, it's the heart of our internationalization at FIU. Because the purpose of our university, of any college or university, is to exchange and produce new knowledge with the world's teaching and learning network. That is the reason why we have higher education. And so the way we do that is through global learning, on campus, in the community, abroad, and online. And so I'm sure you figured it out by now. That's what COIL and Virtual Exchange is all about. Connecting ideas, connecting people. But we don't have to get up and get on an airplane. We might even be able to do it with people who are in our own city, because there's so much diversity and so much to learn, even in our own city. We don't have to necessarily exchange any money. We don't even necessarily have to have a formal partnership agreement if that is the culture of our campuses, but we can still use technology to connect people and their ideas. And if you would go to the next slide. So to do this, we still had to have an infrastructure. So for our global learning program, we have our office, the Office of Global Learning Initiatives, that coordinates everything within the university that has to do with global learning. But we don't have any power over anybody. We have to network with the other offices in our university and outside of our university to do many of the things we want to do. So because technology is so important as part of COIL, my office partners very closely with our Office of Educational Technology Services so that we could understand things like how much connectivity do we have in our university? What are the applications that our students and faculty are used to using? What kind of technology do we have in our classrooms if we want to have an entire class, talk to an entire class somewhere else? And who can help us with this? So we really needed a partnership with educational technology. And then we also needed some money. I saw a question within the chat. And our mentor, Ava and Sarah, my mentor, says this all the time. COIL or Virtual Exchange, it's not free. But you might have the resources that you need on your campus. And that's what we found. There were some resources, but we had to coordinate them and connect them. So one was educational technology. Another was that there is a fund in our university for anything that will use technology to support all students' learning. So we applied for a grant, and that grant helped us with two things. One is it helped us buy a new software platform called VoiceThread that we thought would be good to enable COIL. The other thing is it helped us to work with a consultant, because as Sarah was talking about and Ava was talking about, like, we were at the very beginning. We needed, how do you teach teachers how to do this? I needed to learn how to do that. So we were able to bring in trainers. We were able to bring in consultants to help us think through, what will our COIL program look like? It's not going to look exactly like any other college or university. How do we integrate COIL with our existing global learning program? And that's what the consultants helped us with. And also, even Sarah came to the university and she trained some of our very first faculty. So we learned how she trained. Then my office now supports through two main things. One is by matchmaking. So I serve as a coordinator for our COIL initiative. So I'm the head matchmaker. And so I don't know how you say matchmaker in Portuguese, but it's all about trying to find where are their unique qualities that people might not even see themselves that would make them good partners. So it's very fun, and I help to connect our institutional partners that we have in our different colleges. And I also connect with institutions that are doing COIL all around the world. I find out who's doing the work, and I email and I make the matching. And the second part is through professional development. I work with faculty, I give some courses, we have some different institutes, lots of different ways to coach faculty to help the partners make the courses together. And then the other big thing that I do is help to connect COIL to all of the other parts of our internationalization plan. So right now, many of the traditional ways that we do internationalization involve people moving, involve physical mobility. That tool for connecting people and ideas will come back, but we don't know when, and we do not know how. So right now, we are forced to pick up new tools and learn how to use them. One of them is COIL. So how can we use COIL to create new partnerships that will become mobility partnerships or research partnerships later? How can we take dual degree programs that involved mobility and rethink them to integrate COIL into them? How can we use COIL to perhaps to recruit new groups of students to our university for master's degrees or for doctoral programs? We're just in the beginning stages of this, but someone in the chat was asking, what are the business models for this? How do you fund this? This is the exciting what's next for COIL, and the thing that our leaders need to really, internationalization leaders really need to think about. And then the final thing that we did as a university is we wanted to open our doors to thinking this way collaboratively with other universities. And we've had, for the last 2 years, a leadership institute for teams that come to FIU to kind of think through their strategic plan for COIL and virtual exchange. And we will continue that, but we're not exactly sure what model that will take in the future. And that is what I have to say for now.
Stephanie, I would just I'll ask one question before the other people start intervening.
I'll squeeze in.
That, obviously issues of money and financing come up. So I'm wondering to what degree you got a grant and you were able to bring in COIL consultants. How much of that knowledge that you got from these people were you able to then use in a kind of train the trainer model, so that then people at your institution were able to do it themselves and you no longer needed to pay consultants to do it? Because I think that's an important financial issue.
That is exactly what we did. So as you know, we invited you to come and do a professional development workshop for our faculty. And we took the things that you were teaching and said, okay, what is the language that we use at FIU, right? And how do those things that you were teaching, how do they fit into our current professional development models and also our different strategies that we use to document how courses are taught? So we really made it our own. And I will say that one of the most fascinating things that I've found is that really what happens is that faculty start to then teach each other also. So one of the best professional development mechanisms that we have is every month we have just an open meeting. Now it's online. It used to be both online and face-to-face, of the teachers who do COIL, or people who want to do COIL, or people who did it in the past, anybody. And they just share stories. And they connect each other to new partners, new teaching strategies. And then they also start to talk about how they apply COIL methodologies in their non-COIL courses.
Yeah,
as I was saying. Yeah,
I was just going to say, it's like they say when medical students, see one, do one, teach one, right? But it does help to build a community of practice, because I found, because I am a lecturer, so I am doing COIL, it's sometimes easier to persuade other professors to do COIL than if there's someone who works in an international office, never really is engaged with students, says, you know, I've heard about this thing, you should do it. It's a much harder sell. So to get buy-in, definitely use professors and their experience. I found that also to be a very successful strategy.
Can we do questions now?
Yes, I have, first of all, I would like to just tell you, as I told you, they were really tough. I was not, and that's thank you so much. Thank you so much. We have a lot of questions. I have selected some of them. Let's start with Sarah. A question from Italy, Sarah, from Firenze. Could you share some of the strategies used by facilitators that you were formed to be the most efficient with students who are dealing with virtual exchange the first time? Which strategies facilitators can use?
Well, I would first say that when I started doing this work about 15 years ago, I was doing it with engineering students who were not particularly inclined to be doing this type of activity because it was so different than what they were doing in their other courses, which were primarily lectures. And in my experience, and I'm sure Stephanie and Ava can speak to this, they are hesitant and maybe uncomfortable at the beginning, but once you've created the initial contact, then they get it. And I think so that's the whole one thing we didn't talk about today because there wasn't time and it wasn't written to the program is how you should design these programs, the virtual exchanges. And so when I talked about the definition, I used the word sustained. And what I meant by that is anywhere from 4, 6, 8, 10 weeks so that they have time to get to know one another. And really the first week or two needs to be made up of icebreakers. So these students are learning that these people they're communicating with in another part of the world are students just like them. And, you know, they are able to make connections by the fact that they are students in a certain faculty or just because they're connecting with one another and are young people. So icebreakers are really, really important. And one of the challenges when you're doing the training is that many professors and teachers are very focused on content and how much content they need to cover in a course. And icebreakers take time away from that content because you're dedicating time to students talking about other things. So talking about their personal lives, their experiences, who they are, these sorts of things, what they think. But it's really important for them to do that because that helps establish a relationship and will allow them to then engage with one another more effectively once they get into the more collaborative part of the virtual exchange. And the other thing I would add to that is that I think the synchronous is really important. So what we're doing right now, so it's not actually what we're doing right now, but seeing somebody, hearing somebody, listening to their voice, is really important, and it's very different from just writing in a forum. So even Stephanie mentioned the fact that her university invested in VoiceThread. So VoiceThread, for example, allows people to share audio and video. So that gives you a better sense of who the person is, and it allows you to make a connection. So, you know, I could share with anybody a list of icebreakers, but I'm sure people are familiar with the concept, you know, showing people just even picking up an object in your room where you are. What does that mean? Why? What does that say about you? Somebody, you know, commented, I talk to people and they see that there's a basketball picture here in the back. And then I talk about my kids and how they love basketball and this sort of thing. So the synchronous really allows people to build that relationship. And I would also add that when possible, it's really nice when these synchronous conversations can be facilitated by people who are trained to facilitate this kind of discussion. So that, you know, I think however many people in this room right now are teachers, you have the student who sits in the back and never talks and never, you know, shares their experience. Whereas if you have trained facilitators and you're working in small groups, they're able to draw out those people and make sure that everybody's voice is heard. So yeah, it's when you do virtual exchange, especially within a course, when you embed it within a course, you have to not necessarily give up content, but dedicate definitely time to students building relationships. And once they do, I mean, I think most people that I've worked with in the past 15 years would say you set up a session for an hour for students to get to know one another, and then you can't shut them up. They just they're enjoying it so much that they're like, no, is it time to go already? And you're like, yes, it is.
And if I may add to that, I think it's also very important. We spoke earlier about how the process and intercultural learning is important. So make that intentional, make it part of your learning outcomes. Because if your assessment and your learning outcomes are only about the topic you teach, if you don't test it, they won't learn it. So you need to make it explicit, specific, and intentional, so that the icebreaker is part of your assessment. So you're not going to assess whether they like each other, but you are going to assess, so did you invest in getting to know the other? And so the process is just as much part of the learning as the content or the topic is. I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I think the other thing I would add to that is what I have found in many years of doing this work is that to a very large degree, it's not necessarily what they're learning about the other, but what they're learning about themselves and having to explain themselves to the other. And I think that's a really important part of this process, because people don't necessarily sit back and reflect on who am I, what culture am I a part of, where have I come from. I mean, I've had many students who say, well, I don't have any culture. Well, no, actually you do. And so then when they have to explain certain things. So I think that's one of the other major benefits of virtual exchange, is that they learn about themselves as well.
Yep.
I have a question for Stephanie related to language. People not speaking a second language. What kind of strategy do you recommend more inclusive? And how can we define COIL as a process to promote equity, inclusion, equity?
Yes. Okay. I'm definitely going to engage my colleagues in answering this question as well. I'm just going to share some of the things that have happened for us. So one of the reasons our faculty are attracted to COIL, especially when there are strong language differences, I think it's because they are brave. And they feel that they need to be brave in order to create more bravery for their students, because the world in which is filled with these kinds of language differences. It just so happens that in Miami, we're a little bit more used to the fact that I walk into my grocery store and everyone is immediately speaking to me in Spanish. Immediately. So I have to get comfortable with that. So what do I use practically? I use Duolingo to teach myself some basic terms and phrases. So we have faculty, when they know that they're having their students work with partners where there's a severe language difference, they will say, you must earn the first 3 or 4 digital badges in Duolingo or Mango languages in order to participate. That's part of what I'm going to grade you on. So we encourage our students to learn languages. We encourage our students to make use of the tools of Google Translate, but we encourage our students to be humble, right? So to not assume that the translation, they need to learn that the translation may not be good. And so to learn how to ask questions, am I understanding you correctly? And to make use of symbols, of art, of music, to use films, to use different ways to encourage people to feel more comfortable with the discomfort of the different language capacities. Yeah, please, Eva, go ahead.
If I may jump in, I think Sarah mentioned about the virtual exchange that has as goal language learning. But we talked about all the other goals that you could have, which are more about communication than they are language. So if it's not about learning a language, but being humble or being aware, for example, that there's world Englishes. English is not necessarily the English spoken by a group of students in the United States or Australia or Canada or the UK, but the English that they use in Vietnam is a variety of world Englishes. That's one, to understand that and to be comfortable moving in that world where English is a tool to communicate. And then also that language is not the only tool to communicate. And Stephanie, that's why I jumped in, because I think in a lot of projects we rely too heavily on words to convey a message, where if we also use imagery or storytelling, there's actually a lot you can do that it does not. So if you make students write reports, yes, the students that they are most confident in speaking English or whatever language you use as the language of instruction, they will do most of the writing. But you can also have them think of a creative idea and make pictures of it. You know, that's also communication. So I think we need to be flexible and creative in how we interpret that kind of learning. Sarah, you probably have something to say as well.
Yeah, background in language teaching, just. But I think the two things I would add to what my two colleagues have said, and I fully agree with, well, a few things. First of all, not everything has to be done in English. Okay.
Absolutely.
There are bilingual exchanges. There's translanguaging. There are other ways to approach the language issue. That said, I think it also, this takes us back to the issue of training, and that professors be fully aware of what they're quote unquote getting themselves into, in that you need to discuss if it's going to be English, and if one of the partners are native speakers of English, this is something that needs to be discussed beforehand between the teachers, so that they can then go back to their classrooms locally and say, so the American teacher can go back and say, be aware that you are speaking with people who are non-native speakers, which, Miami aside, I think, and a few other places, it's actually more beneficial for the native English speakers who are monolingual, because most people in the world are not monolingual. They're bilingual or multilingual. So I think it's actually more of a linguistic experience for the monolinguals out there than it is for the others. But so that you can go to your classroom, if you're in Italy, for example, where I am, and I say to my students, you guys, you know, are speaking to them in English, and that's their language. And the way that you speak English is so much better than the way that they speak Italian, if they even speak Italian. So, you know, you already have this, you have this gift, and it's a gift of communication and being multilingual, and be proud of that. Don't be ashamed of it. But another thing I would add to that is that for years I did exchanges similar to the Brazil e-tandem, where I would set my students in Italy up with students in another country who were studying Italian. And I slowly moved away from that model because I found that for my Italian students, speaking with other students who were not native speakers was much easier. And they were less stressed out if they weren't speaking with native speakers. And so you could have, you know, whatever learners of English. So my students are studying English here, but maybe students of anything else in another country. It could be multidisciplinary. And they do the exchange in English, but nobody's a native speaker. And so I think that when we're talking about global Englishes, world Englishes, that lowers the pressure on students.
I will just say one thing to which I know might be the last idea, so sorry if I get it in, because I know we're at the time. One is that the idea here through professional development and supporting faculty is not to make things easy. We want things to be hard. We want our students and faculty to encounter challenges and learn how to work together to overcome them, because that is what intercultural, international, and global learning is all about. And two, we generally think of education as being how much more you know by the end of an experience. And one of the great benefits of learning through COIL and virtual exchange is we learn how much we don't know. And that in order to learn more, we can only do that by connecting to people who know things that are totally different than what we know. So it's a little backward, but I think that's the way forward for a better world.
I'm just going to add this one last thing and say that Ava pointed out the fact that technology comes after pedagogy. And I would say the same is true for language.
Yep.
You find ways around language differences. First, the pedagogy. What do you want these young people to learn from one another? And then you figure out the rest. And there are solutions.
Absolutely.
Okay, we're just finishing the webinar, but we still have time to one or two more questions, depending on your great answers. A very direct question. How do I convince faculties to do this switch?
Do the switch to buy in,
yeah,
to try it out.
Yes.
Yeah. One thing, and I say this as a lecturer myself, lecturers have a tremendous soft spot for their students. So go where their heart is, which is with, if you can convince them that this is beneficial to students' learning, that this motivates them, that this is something new and interesting, that often is a great motivator for lecturers. Another thing I do is to sort of create a soft landing. What we try to do is set up sort of a COIL experience for professors themselves. So with partners, they try out what it feels like, so that they experience a little bit the modality, and they get a chance to feel what it's like, and that it's less scary. And then I talk about how it's very important to address the issue of how you're going to facilitate with partnering, with training, with that they're not in it alone. Because I think if you put it out there and they can't really imagine what is it like, do I have to do this all alone? That is very scary, and they have a lot on their plate. So you need to sort of meet them where they are. And some are at this place of, exciting new technology, innovation, I want to try. And some are very connected to, what do my students need? How can I motivate my students? So I always try to find that sweet spot to see where are the professors and what motivates them most. I don't know what you guys want to add to that.
has more experience here than I do, but I'll just add this one thing, that I think it completely depends on cultural context and institutional context, so not even cultural context.
Mhm.
So I think one of the challenges we're facing as a field right now is that the field has grown very much based on the initiative and of these people who do believe that it's important for their students, and they think that they're willing to put in the extra effort because they think that it's good for their students. But I think there are other institutional contexts where if there is not support from above, from the administration, also in terms of course release or incentives, financial incentives, then it's not going to take off. So I think it also depends on the institutional context.
Yeah, it does. And I'll combine my answer with another question about how should an institution get started with something like this. The first thing is, if you have to get started by convincing people, those people that need to be convinced are probably not the right people. They're not the low-hanging fruit that Eva was talking about to really start a fire. So what you want to do is you want to build a fire for COIL in your institution, and you do that the same way you would build any kind of fire, right? So you're starting with the brittle, small, very thin twigs that may have not even very much power. So what we're starting with, if we are only going for faculty, then we want to simply share, tell the story of what COIL is. And if we can bring in someone from other institutions or who can tell the story, and the people that raise their hand and say, I want to do this, I just need help, those are the people that you want to involve in the beginning. Your job then is to add some more fuel to the fire by telling their stories, right? By having those faculty share their stories. And someone else will write you an email that you've never even heard of before and say, I heard of this cool COIL thing. And those faculty are attracted to it because they see the meaning for their lives. They get to decide why they want to do it. Some faculty will do it because they just like to innovate. Some will do it because they have already a partner. Some will do it because they grew up in another part of the world and they want to bring their childhood experience to their students. There are so many reasons why faculty want to do this. We cannot think of all those. Our job is to share what it is, bring in the first people, and then share those stories, and it will start to take off. Now, once we get to a certain level, after the initial adopters who don't need support, as Sarah was rightly saying, there are lecturers, there are faculty who are contingent faculty. They are making very little money, or faculty that must be thinking about they have other responsibilities. They will need a release to do it. They will need some travel money. They will need their department chair. That's a whole different level of support. So we have to think about this in stages. And it's the same thing with our leaders. We can bring all of our administrators to the table, share what COIL is, and then ask them the question, can you see a way that COIL would help you to do what you want to do, what your goals are better? And when people come to it because they attach themselves, that's how you really build the fire.
Okay, thank you so much, especially because in Europe it's 10 p.m. Thank you, ladies. And we will, if you agree with us, we would like to address you the questions that has not been answered, and then you can answer them, and we can publish this in our websites. I really want to. Do you want to make some final comments? Very brief. Please feel free.
Sure. I think what I would mostly like to say to people, you can think very long about this, or you can just try and do it. And very often, if we wait for the top down, the decision makers to get on board, to get everybody aligned, you can sometimes wait a very long time. If you're getting excited about this idea, if it gives you energy, try. And it doesn't have to be a very complex, big thing. You can start small and take baby steps, or just dip in the toes to see how the water feels, and join this community. There's a beautiful, well, I think Sarah, Stephanie, and I are testimony to this. There's a community out there that it's really interesting to engage with. So if this gives you energy, go for it. Start and just try it. That's what I would like to say, to encourage people to just do it.
Thank you. Sarah, Stephanie, do you want to add some comments, final comments?
Ava just took what I was going to say. Literally, she took what I was going to say. This is this is a special time in the world's history, and might be an opportunity if we have leaders that are supportive to do things that are different and are innovative, and to take those baby steps. Now is the time to try it. Yeah.
Thank you. Sarah?
So I guess I would say, I hadn't realized that the chat was there, so I was just looking through the Q&A right now. In terms of
final to close.
Yeah, just in terms of student feedback, I mean, it's pretty amazing how transformative this can be if it's done well. And so I would really focus on the doing it well part. So I think it is important to just go in there and start trying it. But when it's done well, of course, it's not the same experience as going and living in another country. But in some cases, it can be more powerful if you're discussing issues that you wouldn't necessarily discuss with people you're just meeting on the street when you're living in another country. So I would really push the idea that, if you're interested in doing this kind of thing, yes, start it, but also then maybe look for people who can help you develop programs that really are effective. And the other issue is, a few people asked about international officers. We actually have someone working with us at Uni Collaboration who was an international officer here at the University of Padua for many years, and she has much more experience from that point of view than I do. So I'm just, I'm a teacher. So if you're interested in that perspective, you can write me an email, and I'd be happy to put you in touch with her. And finally, I'd just like to say that thank you, FAUBAI, for inviting us to do this. It was nicer to be in Porto Alegre and other places to visit with you guys, but it's nice that you've done this online, and I know you're going through a very difficult time. I think in Italy, it seems that we're kind of heading towards the end, but then who knows what's going to happen next. But so just kind of my love goes out to you all, to be quite honest. Just exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah. Be safe, and these are challenging times. And I guess I just conclude with what Stephanie was saying, that we are a very strong community of practitioners. And so we're here for everyone. Reach out to us. We're more than happy to talk to you guys and to work with you. So thank you for being here. Thank you for inviting us.
Okay, thank you. On behalf of FAUBAI board, I would like to thank the speakers, these three spectacular women. I'm really happy to have just women in this webinar, and also very especially the participants. We had 307 attendees. And we also want to thank very especially José Freire Jr., Associate Provost for International Affairs at Universidade Estadual Paulista, Unesp, for co-organizing and giving the backstage support for this webinar. Thank you, Celso. Thank you so much. And we would like to invite you all to join us next Wednesday, June 1st, at 3 p.m. Brazilian time for the third FAUBAI BRaVE webinar, virtual exchange experience from 3 Brazilian universities that will be run in Portuguese this time. Okay, see you next Wednesday.
No. Thank you, Renee.
Thank you, Renee.
Thank you for organizing this and working with Celso. And thank you.
A big and great pleasure, very special one. Yeah. Please have a nice and safe week. Thank you. Muito obrigado. And last but not least, and very, very important, please don't forget to ask the evaluation form that will be available at the end of this webinar. Thank you so much. Thank you again.
Muito obrigada.
Muito obrigada.
Obrigada.
Obrigada.